and for all of you watching online, we are greatly appreciative to have them with us here today.
So that's a very tough act to follow, but I think we have one that they can live up to what Senator Sinclair just shared. As we're a little bit more intimate group, we've decided to take the table away. We encourage those of you who are in the room to move down and keep us company. For this session, it's really my real pleasure and honor to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Alla Murabit. If you've read your program, you'll see that she is a UN High-Level Commissioner for Health, Employment, and Economic Growth. She's been appointed by the UN Secretary General as a Sustainable Development Goal Global Advocate. She's a medical doctor, she's a human rights educator, and she's a peace builder. And I think to appreciate what she's going to share with us and to engage in the discussion, I think it's important to share a little bit more about her personal background, because I think this is what is equally as impressive as those titles. So Alla was born in Saskatoon, the sixth child of a large family. Her parents had immigrated to Canada from Libya in the early 1980s. And in her household growing up, she and her sisters were all treated equally with her brothers. In 2004, her family moved back to Libya, to Zawiya. That's probably not how you pronounce it. Not at all close. Will you forgive me? No, okay, I'm not forgiven. Having finished high school at the age of 15 in Libya, she enrolled in the College of Medicine at the University of the place I can't pronounce, with a specialization in pediatrics. Her final year of university, 2011, was also the year of the Libyan Revolution. Inspired by women's crucial roles in the revolution, she founded the Voice of Libyan Women to politically, economically, and culturally mobilize and empower her fellow countrywomen. Her dedication to inclusive peace processes has resulted in her selection as an Ashoka Fellow, and those of you who may have seen her TED Talk will understand why. She is the youngest Marisa Belisario International Humanitarian Award recipient, New York Times International Trust Women Hero of 2014. She's graduating from being Newsweek's 25 Under 25 to Watch to now being Forbes' 30 Under 30 to Watch. She's an Aspen Ideas honoree. She's involved in a number of organizations as a trustee for International Alert and Keeping Children Safe in the Malala Fund. Most important to me, and where I got to know Alla, was when she was a participant in our International Human Rights Training Program in 2012, and the chance I had last year as she met with a number of our partners and supporters across the country when she visited Canada. So it's really a pleasure to have you with us here today, and for this opportunity for you to share your thoughts around security, leadership, and the role of women in peace building.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. We have such a baby group, so if anybody wants to get closer, and we can get a lot more intimate, a lot quicker. So I'm going to touch base on three key things, and those are the areas that I come to from my work. As you guys had heard, I work specifically on peace building and security processes, sustainability and the Sustainable Development Goals, and of course, health policy. And my main focus within health policy is health security. And from those aspects, because the topic of the day is justice and accountability, I think it's important for us to realize where we're going wrong, for us to be able to recognize where we can go right. And we've heard a wonderful, wonderful account of really the history of this country and the way in which we've actually approached human rights and security in the past. And I know when we all turn on our televisions, we're not necessarily shocked that humans have that capacity and have that ability to completely eliminate or negate the rights of another group or another individual. It's a daily reality we all live with. So I'm going to first touch base on security and the challenge of saying something like security in the first place. So peace is probably the least liked word in global policy. Everybody hates the word peace. When you say we got to build peace, we got to make peace, nobody likes it because it's not as tangible. So we use security as the referent, right? We talk about security and being able to stop a conflict. And often those are very band-aid solutions. They're not sustainable. They're not dependent on local leadership. They're usually dependent on international involvement or resources. They're often much more in the control of the larger, more dominant political force, right? So be it the international community, the United Nations, within Canada, it could be the government, etc. So security becomes the agent that we speak about. And so our global policies tend to know how to make something secure. And I think a good synonym for secure is often stable, right? So it's stable enough for us to get economic investment out of it. It's stable for us enough that we don't see it on the news every day, right? And stable doesn't necessarily mean the problem is gone. It means the problem hasn't escalated to a degree in which we need to give it more attention. Right? So if we have 4 million Syrian refugees in 2015, and we have 1 million less, or even 10,000 less in 2016, that's considered a win for the global security space. That's considered a win. We haven't actually solved anything, but because it hasn't escalated, we pat ourselves on the back and we say we've done a relatively good job. Things are not getting worse. They're stable. They're secure, right? And I think the greatest challenge when we do that is that we no longer actually know how to build peace. We don't even know what the components would look like. How do you sustain a peaceful community? I remember right before Nelson Mandela passed away, a good friend of mine who works with Sky News was there, and she was stationed there in case anything would happen. And she said, the biggest worry is if he passes away, everything combusts. The tensions are so high. That's the reality of building a stable environment. It's built on variables that you can't necessarily control. It doesn't actually identify underlying issues. We don't talk about things like reconciliation and truth and justice and accountability. We talk about immediate resource allocation, potentially immediate land allocation, but we don't actually focus on making that a sustainable peace. And the reason we can get away with this is the second thing I'll delve into, which is securitization. So we heard wonderfully how that's been applied in Canada to our great collective unfortune, that when we securitize something, and securitization is basically when the elite within a society, and that traditionally has been the government, as the nation-state system has evolved, that now includes media, corporate leadership, but it's when the elite within a society says this is a severe security threat, it is an existential crisis, and the government can allocate significant resources, time, effort, and influence towards this one specific subject, right? And some recent examples would be everything from the war on drugs, the war on poverty, the war on terrorism, Ebola, pick and choose, right? That is, AIDS was also securitized. So when you securitize something, you have the free range to absolve yourself of the responsibility towards human rights. Because this now becomes a security threat, right? So for the existence of our people, we need to ensure that nobody with Ebola comes into the United States and Canada, for example. So we defy international humanitarian law and we close our borders. We make sure that we accept no flights from that area. And instead of deploying humanitarian assistance, such as doctors, nurses, people who are well trained, we instead deploy armies. So for the first time since Civil War, the Sierra Leone Army was deployed. Armies that are often foreign trained and that locals do not feel are allegiant to the people and are instead allegiant to a more multilateral order were deployed. Here we don't actually talk about what the underlying issues are, right? We don't talk about the fact that right now we're saying, listen, for our own safety, we cannot accept refugees. We've securitized people. They are no longer human beings, they are weapons. And we turn back 10-year-olds, 15-year-olds, heck, even a 25-year-old guy. We turn them back on the off chance that this one individual will defy historical reality and will become the first refugee to actually commit a terrorist attack. That's not the reality, and that's the cornerstone of securitization. It's that it's not actually a realistic threat. Not to the degree in which the government has allocated resources or support or the media has emphasized. When was the last time a refugee committed a terrorist attack in North America? In recorded history, never. Never. How many people in North America died of Ebola? 1. How many people in North America die of obesity and obesity-related diseases a year? Millions. It's the highest cause of death, from heart disease to diabetes to unwell living, which causes cancer and others. That's our reality. How much do we actually allocate to that? How much do we educate about that? You are more likely to die from a piano falling on your head than you are from a terrorist attack. The 6 o'clock news never tells me about the danger of a piano falling on my head. I have yet to hear about it. I would be much more careful. I would put something in the sidewalks. I would figure this out. But that's not the reality. And the reason securitization is so powerful is because since the 1950s, this Westphalian state system that we have, this Bonaparte state system that we have, since the 1950s, 60s, and 70s has come under heavy stress. It's had to shift. The state is no longer the sole service provider. I don't need to go to the state to get my media or my healthcare or I don't need the state as much as I did in the 1950s. I don't. Communication has opened up. I can get information from other places. I can travel. I can go to another country for healthcare. There's a whole industry now. My state is no longer my sole service provider. So my state has to become relevant. It has to remain relevant, and securitization allows a state to remain relevant without actually providing services. It's an extremely dangerous relationship. The last thing I'll go into is why securitization has succeeded for so long. Now, the term was only coined in the 1980s in the Copenhagen School, but it's been occurring for a much longer time, as we heard with the residential school system here, where they said, you know what, this is a threatening ethnic group and we have to eliminate them, or we have to at least assimilate them in some way. And it's happened around the world. That's the way in which, if you look at, medieval war, the reason that women were raped and women's bodies were seen as the borders of nations was because the fighting group thought, listen, if we can get them to bear our offspring, then they will no longer fight us. Right? So the rights of women were completely negated under the guise of an existential security threat. So this is a historical thing. We've been doing it all the time. The question then becomes, why is it working? Why do we not have people within the peace building or the security space who are saying, listen, we should actually focus on education and healthcare, because those are the clear indicators of a peaceful society. Those are them, the two big ones. And to be more specific, girls' education and women's health care. Scientifically, empirically, that is what indicates a peaceful society. We can actually see the direct relationship between the sustainability, security, and rights of women and the likelihood that a country will go into conflict. As women's rights decrease, it is over 40% more likely that a country will delve into conflict. We can see the direct relationship between having more women in peace and security processes and the success of those processes. So how many peace treaties last 5 years? Who knows? Or how many fail within 5 years? Anybody? Guess. Close. 90%. 90% of our peace treaties, which often take years to actually get on the table, fail within 5. What is the percent of likelihood that they will last 15 years if you have inclusive processes with women? 35% higher. To last 15 years, not 5. 15 years if you have inclusive peace processes. And that's because traditionally we look at leadership in a very masculine and dominant way. We talk about leadership in terms of brute force. That's what we've been trained to do. We've been trained to assume that the power of our nation can be determined through an arms race, not through an intelligence race. And we have completely undermined the meaning of the word compassionate or empathetic to mean something awful. Unless a man cries once or twice, if the president cries once or twice, we're like, oh, what a hero. He can deport 2 million people, but he shed a tear, so he still has a heart. We undermine a lot of the feminine qualities of leadership. And that's because we just haven't had enough women leaders and because culturally it's unacceptable. Even in Canada. She is either titled to be a man in a skirt. She's insulted for being cold, frigid, you name it. And in fact, developed nations actually have a worse problem with women's leadership than developing countries. To be fair, colonialism is responsible for a lot of the changing gender dynamics in a large part of the world. In terms of both racism and in sexism, it was colonial entities which introduced those concepts. The lighter your skin, the better. If you're male, you protect. You're in charge. You have the right. Many matriarchal societies were completely transformed by that introduction, those new concepts. So while now we say, listen, we're way far ahead in terms of women's engagement, we're really not. We're really not. And it's until we see leadership as something that any person, regardless of gender or sex or skin color or religion, can actually participate in, then it's unrealistic we're ever going to move past securitization models or dominant models, where we exercise and control our power through ensuring that nobody else can enter that space. Now, the reason I mention these 3 things, first our emphasis on security rather than peace, the process of securitization, and the limited and exclusive leadership models that we use, is because if we're talking about justice and accountability, it's unrealistic that you're ever going to actually have justice or accountability if the balance of power within a relationship is way off. There is no need for one side to be deemed accountable, particularly if they're the dominant side. And it's until those who have actually been at the hand of injustice all work together and say, listen, we're not getting ahead on our own. It's until those groups begin to elevate leadership within their own spaces and say, we have rivaling forms of leadership. We have a rivaling form of peace building. To us, security means something different. And even from the people in this room, security will mean something different to each and every single one of us. Peace will mean something different. But it's until those voices are actually part of a substantial conversation, until we're able to influence policy, and until we ensure that we're at the table where decisions are made, that we won't actually be able to ensure justice, accountability, reconciliation, or sustainable peace processes. And sustainable peace processes, in my view, include inclusive health education, climate change action. Those are sustainable peace processes. And we have to stop assuming that if it doesn't have a gun or a bomb involved, and if it's not headed by the Ministry of Defense or the Ministry of Public Safety, then it isn't essential for our well-being. Thank you.
Thank you, Ala. That you've given us a lot to reflect on. We have, I'm not sure how much time, but we have time for questions. I think that was the idea, was really to engage in a conversation with Ala. I'm sure, or I hope you have some questions for her. And we have 2 microphones. We can take some questions and then ask Ala to respond. Do we have? That's not a question. Okay. Oh. I don't know if it's being, for the people watching a simulcast, I think you should go to the microphone, but we can start on the microphone on the right if you want.
Thank you very much for your talk and for introducing the concept of the sustainable peace process. What about I'm not sure how the concept of a sustainable peace process applies to an issue such as the Armenian genocide, where it's 100 years. The majority or perhaps all of the people who were affected have passed on. It's the second and third generation. There's something unsustainable about insisting that the world recognize that a genocide occurred to the Armenian people. It isn't sufficient that only approximately 20 countries have recognized it. Someone I spoke with yesterday said that, they're tired of being defined by this issue. I'm paraphrasing words that I heard. Should we continue to insist that the General Assembly of the United Nations recognize it? Yet this morning we heard how many resources are allocated to situations that are recognized by the General Assembly. So what about the unsustainable justice and accountability? One that's difficult to continue with but impossible to let go.
We'll take the next question and then we'll go ahead.
Okay. Thank you for being here and thank you for your very inspiring speech. I like the fact that you go, for me, when you talk about sustainable solutions, you go to the roots of some of the issues that we mentioned this morning, a lot of the issues actually. A lot of the refugees, of course, when there's a situation of war and a crisis, it's immediate. But a lot of the refugees around the world are environmental, social, educational, health refugees, where we're in the privileged country, hypocritically produced, include their land grabbing, the exploitation, like for just consumption, high consumption. So to me, that would be part of the solution, and I wanted your take on that. If you could see these kinds of proactive ground actions have a repercussion on the problem, the issue of having refugees leave their home, because I'm sure many of them would actually prefer to stay home if home was safe, if home provided food, education, and so on.
We'll take one more question and then.
We hear about this Armenian genocide quite a bit. We hear about Holocaust. We hear about few of the genocides which were committed on this earth, and hope to God it never happens again. It is really bad. But there has been genocide, so many, like the partition of India and Pakistan in 1947, done by the British. We lost 3 million people, 3 million. Then Bangladesh separation from Pakistan, the whole world witnessed it. We lost a lot of people out there. So there have been genocides other places too, and we don't hear about them. So there must be some reason that certain tragedies have been publicized. And the other thing you said about women and peace, I agree with you, but this is a kind of a enigma and a question in my mind. How come that whenever a woman is a leader of the country, they have gone to war? Margaret Thatcher took you to Falklands, Golda Meir, Bandaranaike, Indira Gandhi, and all these ladies, few ladies we had as head of the government, their countries went to war. Is it to prove that I'm tougher than you or something like that? There must be some reason that it happened. Thank you.
I'm going to start off with the first question. I don't think there is a peace or a justice that is, a justice or accountability that isn't hard. I think all justice and accountability is hard. You are asking people to be held responsible for their actions. And more than that, I think naturally with justice and accountability come reparations and comes actual consequences for their actions. So I don't think there is an easy one. And I can't speak specifically on the Armenian genocide. It's not my place of expertise, and I'm sure you know much more in that area than I do. But I don't think it's possible to tell people of any background when they have been violated or when an injustice has been wrought upon them to let it go. I don't think that's a realistic response. I don't think a community can grow. I don't think a community can be healthy if accountability and justice are not served. Now, I can give you a very political answer as to why the situation has remained that way, and it would reflect also on why certain atrocities are given more attention. But that comes into a global balance of power, right? And that comes into which countries are the most economically, strategically, and politically important. And it's a very cynical answer, but it's the truth, right? So I hope that covered your question. Oh, yes. So climate refugees and kind of the situation that occurs in many countries around the world, and I'll give you another example, is we have a food insecurity problem in a significant part of the world. We have an obesity and waste problem in the other half of it. And rather than say, listen, we need to start talking about lowering our own consumption, we need to start addressing local solutions, we need to ensure that there's local solutions, we're now attempting to impose our ideas yet again. And say, okay, well, you know what, we're going to talk about food insecurity in Guatemala, but at the very same time, we're going to take land to grow organic farms and kick people out of their own homes, right? So there's a certain amount of hypocrisy, and that's something that we've seen time and time again. Our industrial development came at a significant cost, and now we're asking countries that are in the midst of their own development, don't use fossil fuels, don't develop in the way we did, figure out a new way, right? Without actually affording any type of support, assistance, resource management, anything, right? So and that's not to say that we don't actually need to diversify, but it is to say that we need to walk into spaces with a recognition that a lot of our policies have caused these situations. Will we politically admit that? Very often not. I don't see it happening. In fact, the refugee crisis is a good example. You know, who knows why the UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and the International Organization for Migration, why they were even created? Who can tell me? When were they created? After World War II to address European refugees. After World War II to address European refugees. The Convention on Human Rights, the Convention on Refugees was born in Europe, and it's dying in Europe in front of us. And that's because there's a certain amount of hypocrisy into who it applies to. And it comes back again to education and to awareness and to knowledge and to a belief that you can only maintain power and authority if you are the dominant body, right? So people who don't look like you or sound like you are not afforded the same rights and opportunities. And you know, we can hope. And I hope that we begin to have a lot more educated, compassionate, and I don't mean educated in terms of they graduated from university, I mean educated in terms of historical awareness and an understanding of historical reality and what these countries have taken from others. Because if you want to talk about the United States or Canada, and we can use Canada as a good example because often it's assumed that we did not benefit from things like slavery or colonialism because we were not ourselves a colonial power, an external colonial power, expansionist power. But the bulk of our trade is with the United States, 80 to 90%. And the United States was built on the backs of slaves and colonialism, as was Europe. Those are our two key trading partners. That is what we have benefited from. So it may be indirect, but we are immediate beneficiaries of it. And until we begin to actually recognize that, and that's from an external perspective. From an internal perspective, Canada was built on the backs of the First Nations people. So, I mean, we have to start being more honest, and that will take leadership. It takes a different kind of leadership. It takes a leadership that is much more about, and I'll say it this way because of, I'm a doctor, so it's the easiest way to explain it, but it takes a leader who, when somebody walks in with gangrene, doesn't say, here, let me patch that up and put a Band-Aid on, but actually debrides it, and if necessary, cuts it off, right? That's the kind of leadership it's going to take. And sometimes that might not be the easiest thing for that leader to do, but that's the situation we're in. And until we're more honest, I personally find it very difficult to believe any Canadian government that does not first and foremost admit their own internal atrocities and start talking about the way in which they've impacted, rather than say like, oh, you know, you're welcome, we're taking in a few thousand refugees. You cannot be part of a global arms trade that is worth trillions of dollars, that is dropping bombs on people, and say you're welcome for taking you in. They wouldn't be in that position without your economic gain, right? So to me, there's a certain amount of hypocrisy we do have to address within the global political space. Women causing wars. So first off, that statistic is entirely infactual. It's anecdotal at best. But secondly, you know, I would like for a wonderful comparative of how many men have caused wars. If you give me that percentage, because I'm pretty sure the world is, you know, in a bag of, like, I would say inappropriate words here, and it's not because of women's leadership, that's for sure. Statistically, what we do know is that if you have 30% of parliament are women, corruption decreases. That's the statistics. We know statistically that the country that has had the least sexual violence and conflict was Colombia, and that was because they had more women in their armed forces. That inclusion meant that there was not that much human rights offenses on the local population. We know that statistically, when you have women included in peace processes, local communities trust the peace process more. That's because they don't see women as being as politically or militarily advantageous or opportunistic, right? Those are the statistics. We know that if you educate one girl for an extra 2 years, if she can finish 2 years of high school, 10% of your country, if you educate 10% of the girls in your country, you get a 2 to 3% increase in GDP. That's what we know. We know that women reinvest 90% of their economic resources into their community, as opposed to men who only reinvest 30%. We know that if you educate a girl, and you ensure women's maternal health care and maternal support, then you are ensuring the vaccination of her children and a break in the cycle of poverty. That's what we know, right? So I find it very, very, it's a kind of a misdirection to say because of person X, Y, and Z, this happened, right? That's kind of what we're trying to move away from. We're not trying to say, you know, because a person of this background did this, or because a person from this country did this, or a person of this gender did this, then that we wipe that all with the same brush. We need to start being a bit more honest about, first off, why women are not more involved in policy, why we don't have women leading peace negotiations, why it's very difficult for a woman to be a head of state, even in some of the most educated and advanced democracies in the world. We need to be honest about the fact that women own less than 1% of the land, despite the fact that they're 90% of small farm owners or small farmers. We have to have honest conversations about the fact that a patriarchal society exists in which women have been undermined, their leadership has been negated, and that goes from everything from policy, society, to religion. And in particular religion, because religion has been, whether we like it or not, a huge cornerstone in a lot of the global policies. And in a lot of the national policies, be it from my own country, Libya, where religion plays a significant role in women's ability to advance, to Argentina, to the United States, where they still have "In God We Trust" on their dollar bills, where women's reproductive rights are still under debate, under some guise of morality, when it's really a conversation about male dominance. And it comes back to the same question about why a developing country may not necessarily be held accountable for its actions, right? It is about power. And when we talk about women's inclusion in these spaces, what we're really talking about is taking power from the referent agent. And the referent agent has been men, by nature of their own determination, right? I think I answered all the questions.
Yeah. Well, I wondered if, I just had a question just to follow up on that in terms of, if you could share some of your practical experiences of how you've actually been involved in building inclusive peace processes that are more sustainable, and how did you go about making sure that women were at the table?
So I actually have just one piece of advice on this, and that's change who your referent agent is. I never walked into a room, seeking out the militia leaders or the male political leaders. I walked into a room saying, we want the women. And when we had men come up to us, and a colleague of mine actually in Myanmar invited women and men, and one of the men came up and said, "This is disrespectful. How dare you invite her?" Like, this is completely, unacceptable. We speak for the community. And she said, oh, you're free to leave. You're free to leave. And that's what it comes down to. We have to start changing the rules of engagement, because in my opinion, and this is obviously a very personal opinion, I think we're taught that we should be thankful for the opportunities we're given, despite the fact that we've worked twice as hard for them. And our experiences and our voices are as legitimate. So if that's the case, and if we know that what's happening is not necessarily what needs to be happening, and our voices are not being heard on those platforms, then I think we need to start creating those platforms together. And there's enough women in enough spaces that we can start to mobilize that, right? It just comes from a recognition that it's, and the one thing I will say is, it's so easy for people to come in and try to divide minorities. It's minority politics, right? So if it's a gender minority, such as women, or an ethnic minority, the first strategy from the dominant actor is always to divide them. So for women, it's like, oh, there's the young women and the older women. There's the more masculine women and the more compassionate, feminine women. There's the educated. There's the developed and the developing. There's, you can put a whole bunch. There's the very wealthy elite women and the grassroots workers. And that is a political tool, and I think what we need to do as women is recognize that it really doesn't matter if you're older than me, more educated, wealthier, less wealthy. At the end of the day, we're both women, right? And if our ideas and our experiences are in line with what we believe should be happening for our community, then we need to really start taking all those kind of superficial, societal constructs away. We need to start doing that. It's the same thing that I think needs to happen between minority communities. A lot of minority communities, the First Nations community, Jewish community, Muslim community, Sikh community, have all gone through similar ostracization and ridicule and at times genocide, and all of these things. They have a shared shared histories in that regard, and yet we continue to allow ourselves to be divided by very superficial constructs. So I think part of it is unification and strong leadership, and part of it is just changing what the priority is. The priority shouldn't be having the men in the room. They don't help.
All right. We had one question here, and I think there's another question. If you can go to the microphone, please.
Yeah, hi. I just, first of all, want to say thank you for putting the access on women, because I've sort of been waiting to hear that said a little bit more directly in the past couple of days. And I'm wondering, one thing I notice a lot in North America anyways, is we seem really good about acknowledging acts of misogyny and oppression everywhere else, without even a hint of irony towards domestic abuse and things like that go on here. And I'm wondering, in your own experience, if that's commonplace, and if so, what kind of advice you might have in terms of how to manage that or ways to address that.
Do we have another question? We can take it now, and then we'll ask Al to respond to both.
I'm fairly new at getting involved in anything political, and just in trying to change the system, I see women standing up like Cindy Blackstock, who has won her case against Canada regarding the native education system, that they were deficient, and she won the case. And she's had to go back 3 subsequent times to have anything altered or changed. Also, when we do grassroots political protests against resource extraction that's irresponsible, certain pipelines, now they're going to establish a law to arrest economical sabotage people. So, I mean, every time you stand up against the system, they put a new law in place to hold you back, to put you back in your box, and to maintain. Like, Canada is still not having any repercussion for this genocide that's occurred.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, and I'm going to spear it into 2 points. The first is the way in which we organize. So actually the first is, I'll tell you an anecdote. When I was 21, when I started my organization, nobody was listening to anything I said, which, believe me, is hard to do because I talk a lot. And I don't stop until somebody gets my point. But somebody who I consider a very close mentor, actually at the time, I did not know him very well. Much older gentleman, has been in the global political scene for a very long time, looked at me and said, listen, when you walk into a room, people don't hear you. People see a young woman who is Arab and who is Muslim. Those are your 4 challenges: your gender, your age, your ethnicity, and your religion. And he said, you're lucky, your age you'll grow out of. The rest you're kind of stuck with. And at the time, I remember being blown away by this, by somebody saying it to me so bluntly, because we didn't know each other very well. And it has served to be probably the single greatest educational tool of my career. Because what he saw and what people see as weaknesses when I walk into a room have meant that I can speak to people they can't. That I hold credibility and validity with audiences they don't. And that I bring perspectives that an old, 65-year-old white guy will not have. Just by nature of our construction, right? Our different multiple identities that we all have. So I took that into light and I became much more deliberate in the way in which I organized. And what I mean by that, and I'll try to give a tangible example, but we see today, these massive protests against Donald Trump. And I am all for protests. I think it's great to show solidarity, etc. But they're not, in the context that they're being delivered right now, are not being used as legitimate strategic policy tools. Because it only strengthens Donald Trump's message when people are outside and they're a bunch of immigrant workers, or it only strengthens his message. It makes him seem, because he ran on the platform of making America white again, and it makes it seem like he's doing that, right? Whereas who those protests would work well against, who is more penetrable, would be the democratic institutions that promise to uphold democratic votes, right? So the Democrat Party would be one, but the more liberal politicians who need your votes, that's where you're more deliberate. That's where you're more powerful. When you phone bank a senator in your district who needs your vote, or you phone bank your own representative here in Canada who needs your vote, be it the Liberals, NDPs, or whoever, and say, listen, what's happening right now is completely unrealistic, and I'm not going to vote for you. And we have a whole group of people who used to vote for you who are going to vote for your opponent. That's when you can actually penetrate, right? So it's not just about showing displeasure, but it's about doing it in a very deliberate and strategic way. And I think that's where a lot of us have not been able to, because it does feel like the system is always against us. And at the end of the day, systems are built. They're built by people, and all you have to do is slowly dismantle, if not the system, the individuals within it, right? And there's always something, every single one of us has something we hold dear to us. And oftentimes, if you're a representative, your constituency is something you hold dear to you. Your ability to maintain that position of authority and a position of power that has privileged you so much is something you hold dear to you. So if you know that's your point of weakness, that's the weak chain, because it's not going to be the Republicans. The Republicans are only stronger when you go out and talk about, racism or sexism, etc. At least Trump's Republicans. That falls into their status, right? So what we need to be able to do is actually penetrate the areas in which we hold influence. The second thing I'll say is we always do step back, yes. Yes. That's historical, though. Human progression is always, every moment of human progression is always faced with a backward pull, right? And that's on an individual or a collective basis. So don't be discouraged by it. I joke with my parents that I was their forward, and then they had my younger siblings, and it was kind of a nice backwards pull to keep them humble. I'm kidding. But
Goes over well in the family.
Exactly. Oh no, I'm definitely the favorite around the dinner table. But my point is, and I have an internship program where I take on students from around the world, and I always emphasize to them, you're going to have to show up the first. You're going to have to read literally everything. When I started, some people were citing like the Cold War to me as reasons that things were happening in the world today. And they were like giving me specific dates, like, do you remember April 6th, the 1970? And I was like, I have no idea what you're talking about. But I would go into the washroom with my phone and search it. So when I came out, I had as much knowledge as they did, even if theirs was outdated. But it meant that I could sit at that table with as much credibility in their eyes. And it allowed for there to be more credibility in the other things I put forward. But it's about, I think, having grown up with 10 brothers and sisters, the best thing it taught me, and having grown up in Saskatoon, which I like to call the Texas of Canada, which is slightly more conservative and definitely not as integrated as other cities, is that the cornerstone of diplomacy is just being able to speak somebody else's language, right? It's being able to tell people what you're doing in a way in which it does not terrify or frighten them. Because at the end of the day, I think everybody's biggest fear, from a politician to an individual, to a collective community, to an ethnic group, is the fear of not necessarily, first off, being in control of your own narrative and destiny, but more so not being needed, right? There's a desire for us to always feel like we're needed. It can explain a lot of our inter-family politics, our inter-office politics, our government politics, but it's a desire to always feel like you are necessary for progress. And I think if we can always word any type of progress that we want in the most inclusive terms possible, where even a person who on paper would be opposed to it can see themselves as being an agent in it, then we get along much farther, right? The second question was women. What specifically about them? Sorry. Oh yeah, recognizing misogyny. It's always easier to find the flaws in somebody else, right? It's human nature. You know, and a huge part of it is also the nature of the way in which our political systems have been born. So we've been taught in Canada, and like you said earlier, we're very privileged. We've been taught that we're privileged. That's what we've been taught. We've been taught that we have it better than everybody else. And it's difficult for us, I think. The best example I can give of this actually is we were talking about food security and water security with a First Nations community in Saskatchewan. And we're going through this UN spiel about like, oh, this is what our scientists have told us over the years. And an older woman, maybe in her 70s and 80s, looked at me and she's like, so you're telling us what we told you guys hundreds of years ago and trying to package it differently, right? And it's true. It's true. We were saying, like, use all of the animal if you choose to use animal, but try not to. We were, you know, be very, very, like, be very protective of Mother Earth. And we had these cute slogans like, you know, this, you know, we don't have a plan B because there is no planet B, right? And she was like, what are you? This is the cornerstone of what we believe in. This is our relationship. We believe the Earth is continuous to us. And to me, that was actually a very powerful moment because we often tend to assume that we are right? We're taught that we are the most advanced in terms of human rights, and unfortunately the mirror is brought up to us when we're actually tested with it. And I think the refugee situation is a huge test for our quote unquote liberal democracies which support and promote human rights. I don't think it's possible for you know, human rights is not a buffet. You don't get to pick and choose what you want. And especially for people you want it for, right? So I have trouble believing somebody who tells me, you know, I'm a women's rights activist, but I don't believe in the right of, you know, I don't believe that colored women deserve the same as we do. Or I don't believe that a woman can wear whatever she wants, be it if she wants to go around naked or if she wants to wear a scarf. You know, to me it's, the best way I can explain it is that it's human nature, but it's very much taught, right? It's a social norm, and so there's the circle method, which is where if you draw a circle around your feet, that's the person you're most responsible for, right? So if, you know, and this is the only way I can answer the identifying misogyny question, but I'm first and foremost responsible for myself. The other circles that I exist in, be it my family, my work, you know, the global community, my local community, those chains are weak if I'm weak. Right? So I am first and foremost accountable to myself. I cannot start pointing the finger at somebody else's actions and behavior unless mine is solid. And once you're able to ensure that you are, in your own individual capacity, doing what's right and doing what you anticipate and expect other people to do, then you can start talking within your family first, right? Or within your, whatever is your closest group, be it your friends, your family, etc. And from there grow. Because if you're somebody who does not, and I mean, I think we cognitively realize this. When a politician starts espousing family values, but then ends up being, you know, physically abusing his wife at home, right? We recognize that it's hypocritical and we don't believe it. But for whatever reason, when it comes to applying it to ourselves, we have a lot more difficulty.
I think that's a great note to end on in terms of our own personal responsibility. I think remembering that what Alla had to say, that what we want to see, if we want to see accountability and justice, that we need to make sure that power balances are more equal, that we need to make sure that the peace processes are inclusive, and particularly inclusive of women, and we need to get away from this securitization that has taken over our approach to building peace. So please join me in thanking Alla for sharing her insights and her stories with us this afternoon. And I believe we have a break at this point, and in the program it's till 3 o'clock.